almost there. A few more seconds. Dear colleagues, welcome to our monthly webinar, to our dialogue. As you know, this is free and is live streamed in YouTube and Twitter, and then it will be posted on both Twitter and YouTube. I am really happy to announce that the impact factor of the European Art Journal increased from about 35 to about 40 in the last year. And I want to really thank the authors, because this leap forward has been made possible by the excellent quality of the papers we receive. And I want to thank the editors and reviewers and the editorial office for their contribution to this remarkable increase of the impact factor. And also, I'm very happy to announce that we have a very interesting dialogue today with an important American lady, Professor Noelle Berry-Mertz. And it is my privilege now to ask Professor Anne Tyberg-Hansen, Executive Editor of the European Art Journal. And Anne, thank you to you in particular for your contribution to the success of the journal. I'd like to ask you to start the dialogue with Noelle. And the title is very intriguing because the title of this dialogue is From Microvascular Dysfunction to Barbara Streisand, a very intriguing title. Anne, please start.
Yes, thank you very much. Professor Berry-Mertz is director of the Barbara Streisand Women's Heart Center, the Linda Joy Pauling Women's Heart Health Program, the Erica J. Glazer Women's Heart Research Initiative, and the Preventive Cardiac Center at the Smith-Cedars-Sinai Heart Institute. She also is professor of medicine at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. Professor Mertz received her bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago and her medical degree from Harvard University. She completed her residency at the University of California in San Francisco, where she also served as chief medical resident. And she also completed fellowships in clinical cardiology and nuclear cardiology at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Professor Mertz's research interests include ischemic heart disease, women and cardiovascular disease, mental stress and heart disease, the role of exercise and stress management in reversing disease, the role of cholesterol and nutrition management in heart disease, Takotsubo syndrome, adverse pregnancy outcomes, and cardiovascular disease, and precision medicine monitoring to predict unexpected cardiovascular events. She is also the chair of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute-sponsored WISE, and it stands for Women's Ischemic Syndrome Evaluation Initiative, and we'll hear more about that later, I think. And finally, she has an extensive scientific publication record of over 450 scientific publications and book chapters. But I'd like to ask you, what stimulated your initial interest in cardiology?
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Filippo. Dear colleagues, I was a cardiology fellow. I was training in nuclear medicine, and I was charged by Dr. Dan Berman, who leads our cardiovascular imaging here at Cedars-Sinai, to look at a large data set that he had that the SPECT perfusion abnormalities would predict the future heart attack locations in follow-up. We had a baseline SPECT, and then we had SPECTs at 2 and 4 and 6 and 8 and 10 and 12 years later. And I analyzed it. I looked at it 2 or 3 times, and I brought it back to him, and it didn't predict the location. And he said, well, you just haven't done it right. I'm sure it will predict. Do it again. Find some other statisticians. And it didn't predict. And this was a while ago when we understood that obstructive stenoses can be stable. The plaque that's going to rupture and cause a problem is an area that typically is not particularly well revascularized with collaterals. And it's an area that hasn't perhaps been the source of angina or the reason to do the SPECT. So I got very interested in non-obstructed coronary disease. And as a preventive cardiologist, and this was at the beginning of the statin era, after that sort of project with Dan, it became very clear to me that atherosclerosis, if you wanted to think of it as a model, is a little bit like your teenagers that have acne, and they can't predict which pimple is going to erupt on their face, and the eruptions come and go, and there are things that calm it down. And so with that sort of hypothesis in the back of my mind and the statin era coming along, I became very interested in non-obstructive coronary disease and how that could lead to these adverse outcomes. Long-winded explanation, Anne, but yeah.
What about ischemic heart disease? Has that been your main field of interest in cardiovascular medicine since the beginning, or?
Yeah, I would say that that's true. It is the leading killer. So I like to think that what I and my colleagues are working on is something important and significant. As we all know, in order to get research funding, you have to get high significance scores. You need to be studying something that is relevant. And I'm an impatient person, so I was always interested in doing work that was pretty close to the patient care, and thought, wow, maybe I could even see a change in my lifetime, which I think we have. Yeah.
Okay. And then we come to the WISE project. I think one of your favorite babies is this project, Women's Ischemic Syndrome Evaluation Initiative. How did that start?
So that's a great question. It was actually started by a female cardiologist internal at our NIH National Heart, Lung, and Blood, Professor Patrice Nickens. And she had the idea that in response to the epidemic of cardiovascular disease death in women that was recognized by us, the US, and our NIH colleagues in 1984, when the curves crossed, meaning cardiovascular death rates as counted by our CDC, Center for Disease Control, or our American Heart Association. In 1984, for the first time ever, more women died than men. And that carried on for about 15 years. And so in the early to mid 1990s, National Institutes of Health, NHLBI, said, wow, this is a knowledge gap. What's going on? Why are these women dying of cardiovascular disease? All the textbooks say they should be protected. So Patrice, Dr. Nickens, put together, as part of actually the Women's Health Initiative, if you remember that very large observational and randomized controlled trial that was for heart and osteoporosis and cancer. And it included the hormone trials and some nutritional studies. Anyway, the point is there was some leftover money. And Patrice was able to set that aside to study women's heart disease. And she felt like with her colleagues, the biggest knowledge gap was what was at that time called cardiac syndrome X. And for those of us that, were training back in the day, that was dominantly women, although some men, signs and symptoms of ischemia, something that felt like, looked like, smelled like angina, had an abnormal stress test. And yet when you took them up to the coronary angiography suite, they had no obstructive coronary disease. And as it turns out, what was thought to be rare, not a common condition, was quite common in women. And one of our first things that we did was a large meta-analysis of the different acute coronary syndrome, unstable angina, STEMI and NSTEMI studies that had angiographic core labs. So the cores had actually looked at this. And it was less than 10% of men. So if you can't say it's rare, but you would say that it's certainly not common, but it was 30% of women. And so that was sort of the aha moment between National Heart, Lung, and Blood and the group of investigators. My often multiple PI, my partner and colleague in the WISE studies, we're now almost in our 30th year, is Dr. Carl Pepin. And we have led those studies, and I think we've made a lot of discovery about what is now called INOCA, ischemia with no obstructive coronary disease, and MINOCA, myocardial infarction with no obstructive coronary disease. Neither of these are rare. In women, they're pretty common, and we still have a lot of knowledge gaps, but we've gained a lot of ground. Yeah.
So after all these years, what you regard as the most important results from WISE?
Probably the most important result is the prognosis of INOCA, and INOCA continues to be sort of a very broad umbrella term. It doesn't really tell you mechanistically anything, but we have favored using it because it gets people's attention, and it helps treating physicians recognize it as something that should be taken seriously. You should work to understand mechanisms. But probably our most important finding actually is that coronary microvascular dysfunction, which is the term that we have used, our COVADIS network, which includes Professor Kriya, in a large international network that we are publishing regularly consensus statements. The European Society of Cardiology Microvascular Working Group has a lovely statement about 2 years old, that coronary microvascular dysfunction, A, is a real entity, B, it's fairly common in women, it's less common in men, but it's not rare, and that we don't yet really know how to treat it, but it is associated with an adverse prognosis. It's an intermediate risk, it's not low risk, but it's not as high risk as a triple vessel disease. I think that's probably our most important finding, and true, and we don't know if it's related, but as these findings came out about these likely sex differences in cardiovascular disease prevention and diagnoses, we started to see better deployment of what's called optimal medical therapy in women that had, not been treated. And CVD death rates now in the US are comparable to those of men. So in 2 decades, that gap narrowed and then went away. Now, as I say, true and related, we don't know. But we think probably recognizing disease called ischemic heart disease rather than obstructive coronary disease probably has helped at the bedside, and then we see the outcomes improve.
Fascinating, I think.
Well, it has been really a fascinating story, Noel. The first report on Syndrome X was in 10 patients. And
That's
for
right.
many years, it was believed that this was an academic curiosity. While now we know that up to 50% of patients with ischemia and angina do not have obstructive atherosclerosis. And the outcome, as you said, of these patients is not so good as we thought. Recently, we published an interesting review, an interesting meta-analysis in the European Heart Journal, showing that the reduced coronary flow reserve is really associated with a much worse outcome. But Noel, let's come back to you. You have many talents, and I'd like to change page now. You have been devoted considerable efforts to sex-related issues. What triggered initially your interest in this important medical issue? And not just medical. I mean, I also think of society's authorship, we know that there are sex-related issues in different directions. What are your current feelings about it?
That's a great question. And again, it goes back to when I was a cardiology fellow, and part of Dr. Dan Berman's group. Again, I was training in advanced imaging at the time that was SPECT. And I worked with Dr. Alan Rosansky. And he was a very creative thinker and was very interested in mental stress. And we had a very early on New England Journal article that demonstrated, really for the first time, using a structured mental stress test in women and men with obstructive coronary disease, that we demonstrated the mentally stressful tasks, a Stroop word task, public speaking about a fault or a failing in front of an audience and a camera, math subtraction task, working with experimental psychologists. This is what they do. We demonstrated in this New England Journal article that you could engender ischemia using radionuclide wall motion abnormalities, which again was read in a core lab. I mean, you know, for those of you again that remember, this nuclear medicine used to be called unclear medicine, but we actually demonstrated reversible wall motion abnormalities that were ischemia. They were associated with increases in heart rate, increases in blood pressure, increases in sympathetic nervous system tone. And hey, it was good enough for the New England Journal. And it was the first time, I think, that we recognized that the brain and the heart are connected. And for those of you that are younger, this, of course, is obvious to you now. But I think, you know, we, the body of medicine and our patients, didn't think the brain, I mean, you know, your moods and your thoughts and your feelings weren't really connected to your heart. That was just your brain. So that was Sentinel. Now, Filippo, your question is, how did I get interested in sex differences? Well, you know, as a female cardiologist in training, I would, you know, always sort of look at how the women were doing in any kind of study that I was doing. And often there weren't that many women, right? I mean, you know, I suffered from the same bias at the time. Men get heart disease, women don't. But in that cohort, it was about 25, 30% women. And what I noticed, I've just been always very interested in physiology, is the women's reactions were quite different in terms of their heart rate and blood pressure. Their heart rates would go much higher than men. We now know this is true, but it was kind of discovery for me. And they would not elevate their ejection fractions. They often would drop their ejection fraction, even including if they did not have wall motion abnormalities. And again, now we know this is true too, that women and men have different hemodynamic profiles, both at rest and under stressful conditions, be it exercise, mental stress. And I published that. And you know, Dan Berman and Alan said, "Oh, Noelle, that's a subgroup analysis." And I said, "Yeah, but I think it's kind of interesting." And, you know, I published it in, I don't know, the American Heart Journal or something. And it was pretty funny because a year or two later, I get a call and, you know, Dr. Merz, yeah, this is NASA headquarters, you know, like the space people. And I said, really? Is this a joke? You know, like Kim Allen Williams is my buddy. He'll call me up and do funny things on the phone. Kim, is that you? And it was like, no, ma'am, no. Dr. Merz, we need you for an expert panel. And I said, oh, well, what's that about? And he says, well, we have this problem. What's the problem? He said, the female astronauts are fainting in space. And I said, well, yeah, I mean, a general cardiologist could help you with that. They probably need salt tablets. They need anti-gravity stuff. I don't think you need. And he says, well, no, you wrote that paper. You wrote that paper about how women are different. And we need you to come and do some consulting. And one more time, I tried to get out of it. I said, well, again, I see this as probably a relatively short-term thing. I mean, I guess I can look at your data. I don't need to come to Dallas. And he said, no, you don't understand. He said, with the space station, we need to have reproduction in space. And we've decided the only way we're going to do that is women have to be up in space. Because they couldn't figure out how to get men pregnant. I mean,
remarkable.
So I said, okay, I said to myself, these people are nuts. But I did go and I did consulting for NASA for a couple of years, and along with a colleague, Sarah Lynn Marks, who was an almost wannabe. She's a physician at Yale. She almost made it as an astronaut, but she always served as a consultant to them. And we did get them the simple things. They had to. You can't make this stuff up. They were making the women wear the men's anti-gravity spacesuits. Well, it didn't fit. It's like, duh. So we helped them ameliorate the women fainting in space. As far as I know, they still haven't had a pregnancy up in the space station, but that's their goal. So anyway, that's how I got started in that. And it just continued to be a knowledge gap. And gratefully, fast forward 25, I guess probably 30 years now, many other people are looking at sex differences. And in fact, it is ordained at our US NIH. It's the sex as a biological variable, SABV policy. And you are not going to be funded until you tell in your application, in your approach, under the rigor section, how you're going to address sex as a biological variable. Yeah.
Well, this conversation, Noel, is really useful for all of us, but in particular for our younger colleagues. I mean, it is amazing how you move from Earth to space so easily, and we know each other very well. We must confess that we are very good friends. But I didn't know about your involvement with NASA, for instance. It's really a fascinating story. Coming back to the link between brain and heart, do you think this link is stronger in women? Think of Takotsubo.
That is such a good question, Filippo. And
can also be philosophical, not only cardiological.
Yes. We're actually doing MIBG. We have a small pilot protocol, and I think we've done almost 50 now. So we're getting close to, we started to analyze data, and we have controls. We did MIBG, that's the sympathetic nervous system assessment of the cardiovascular innervation, mostly only used for the heart transplant folks, but we're harnessing it for that. And brain and functional MRI. And again, doing the simulated mental stress in the magnet. I'd like to tell you, I know what it shows, but we're just starting to look at the data now. But it's asking that question. Women and men are innervated differently in terms of how they manage blood pressure. So men are much more sympathetically managed, determined. So when you block peripheral sympathetic nervous system, men's blood pressure goes down. Women don't. Women manage blood pressure using multiple pathways. And whenever I start thinking about these sex differences, I think, given what we know about evolution, it must be in some way related to reproductive issues, right? I mean, what is the big difference between women and men at the end of the day? The NASA scientists figured that out. Men still cannot get pregnant. And so women potentially need multiple pathways to manage all of those changes to sustain a pregnancy, to survive the pregnancy, to survive the delivery, et cetera, et cetera. If you only relied on one pathway, maybe we wouldn't be here as Homo sapiens. And so that's kind of the hypothesis that we are studying deep phenotyping of women. There's so few men that get Takatsubos, so unfortunately we don't have them as a control group. Either that or they get it a lot and they die in the field, right? That's the other alternative for why we don't see very many men with the Takatsubos. So we're just comparing them to controls, and it is a pilot. It's an N of 50. There is work, and there's actually quite a lot of work in Europe in the Takatsubo, which I think is very exciting. And because it's not rare. It's not a rare cause of what appears to be acute MI, but turns out to be a Takatsubo in women. So we'll see, Filippo, where that's going to go.
It's a fascinating story, and we will continue to really complete this complex jigsaw with more pieces. We need really many more information to have the full picture of this complex disease. Noel, our webinar is extremely interactive. We have an audience from the 5 continents, and I can read many questions for you. You are generating, not surprisingly, a lot of interest in our audience. I see, for instance, Enrique Sanchez there with a question. Enrique, perhaps you can ask your questions directly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. You hear me?
Yes.
Yes, very well.
Okay. Yeah, Professor Berry, you practically answered my question already.
Okay.
But trying to see more in specific details, given the differences in the reaction, both cardiovascular and central nervous system, peripheral nervous system between the sexes, are there different effects of the beta blockers, specifically more the 3rd generation beta blockers like nebivolol? Are there different actions? Are there studies already done about?
Yes, this is such a great question. And we ask that internally in our group. I'm also a practicing cardiologist. I feel like if I don't see patients 1 day a week, I lose my bedside thoughts, right? You'll see a patient and you'll say, wow, why did that happen? And if you see 2 or 3 of those, you think of a research study. So I wish those studies were out there. What we have found in our clinical practice is our women with INOCA, MINOCA, and we do invasive coronary function testing for the microvascular dysfunction, failure to dilate, in response to an intracoronary adenosine, and then over vasoconstriction in response to low or high dose acetylcholine. That dysregulation in our hands is better treated with an alpha beta blocker than a beta blocker. And even the spasm sometimes does better with an alpha beta blocker. And again, when you think of the things that we do know about beta blockers, not sex specific, and so there are many investigators on this call. So for those of you that have data sets that could be analyzed, or even the capacity to do some physiologic testing, or actually look at some of the newer drugs and sex stratify your data, that unopposed beta blockade can potentiate constriction. And we just don't know enough about, these combinations of alpha and beta, and carvedilol is one, labetalol is another one, nebivolol is our most current and most potent in terms of blood pressure changes. They've used labetalol forever for pregnant women, hypertensive pregnant women, and then preeclampsia and eclampsia works for them. So I think it's a great question. I don't think we know enough about it. We use a lot of carvedilol. It's incredibly well tolerated in these women I would say maybe 60–70% of our coronary and microvascular dysfunction patients are on a low or medium dose of carvedilol with some benefit in terms of angina.
Thank you.
Thank you. I also read another interesting question from Mohamed Balkis, who is co-editor of the European Heart Journal for Middle East. Mohamed, are you there? Otherwise, I can read your question. And the question, hi,
There he is.
Mohamed, are you there? Yes, please. Can you show yourself? We don't see your face. Or you can, okay, hi, Mohamed, welcome to our monthly webinar. Please, you can ask your question, interesting question directly.
Thanks, Filippo. You know, I'm an interventional cardiologist, and I'm in the field like since I finished from Cleveland Clinic to the Stephen Nissen, Patrick Whitlow, and other people there. I'm working in Riyadh for 21 years. And when we do acute coronary syndrome, to be honest with you, I could see more ruptured plaque, like at least 2 vessels with haziness and clot, more in men than women. Is there any
Yes.
real explanation?
That's an excellent question, and we do have a good explanation. Early on in the WISE, Women's Ischemia Syndrome Evaluation, we worked with Renu Vermani, and Renu actually, welcomed this because she had a freezer full of samples from sudden cardiac death victims at the Bethesda Uniformed Health Services Medical Center, which she was located at the time, along with Alan Burke. And this was before she got stolen by the stent people. But she was actually, working on atherosclerosis, plaque composition, proneness to rupture. Now, it's a biased sample. Everybody was dead, right? This was all sudden cardiac death victims. But she sex stratified that data working with us. And it was very clear that men have higher rates of eccentric plaque that actually ruptures. The fibrous cap is eroding in both women and men, but the men had these more eccentric plaques. It ruptures and it causes a big clot, and that looks like a STEMI, right? ST segment elevation, typical bad chest pain, rush them up to the cath lab or do thrombolysis. Women, particularly younger women, so 55, 65, under the age of 75, were much more likely to have the same fibrous cap erosion, but not big clots at the source, and they had less eccentric plaque, and much more distal small embolization and capillary loss, and what they called microinfarcts. And we published that. So, women and men, sudden cardiac death victims are different, but it does give us a window. And we subsequently followed that up with, we were one of the first IVUS studies, again, back to Carl Pepin at the U Florida WISE site. He did, believe it or not, at that time, intravascular ultrasound was brand new. And, innovation in terms of these WISE women with no obstructive coronary disease, but very clear evidence of ischemia, they had lots of plaque, but you didn't see it. The old school was no obstruction, normal coronaries, right? Because nobody ever bothered to look at the wall. Now we look at the wall all the time with CT angio. So we've learned, right? But we learned from IVUS first that plaque ruptures are different in women and men, particularly younger ages. When women get up into their late 70s, 80s, 90s, they kind of look like men. Their arteries look like men. And, this has been borne out with the type 2 AMIs now. We're seeing a disproportionate amount in women. And then here, the last thing I'll say, because you're an interventional cardiologist, we worked with Steve Nissen, the WISE was all women in the original cohort, so we never had men as a control. We asked National Heart, Lung, and Blood, we wanted to include men as controls, and they just laughed. I don't know why. So we reached out to Steve, and Steve had, a nice quantitative, he had intravascular ultrasound, and we age, sex, and propensity matched to our WISE women. And we published that. That's very, very clear, different plaque deposition. Women deposit their atherosclerosis much more diffusely. They have less of the eccentric plaques. Leslie Shaw is now publishing this out of the CCTA studies. And be careful when you look at studies, because you have to sort of make sure it's not overly biased. If the CCTA is all triple vessel disease, well, there aren't going to be that many 6 differences, because by that point, they're not that different. But if we look at these earlier stages, because we're trying to figure out who's going to have a heart attack, who's going to have an ACS, who's going to develop heart failure, that's when you want to look.
Well, not surprising, there are so many differences, because we have a much smaller Y chromosome, and
it's vanishing.
Not only, yeah, precisely. We have published this recent study from Andreas Zeyer showing that loss of Y chromosome is even worse. The outcome becomes even worse. But I see another Mohammed in the audience, Mohammed Amar, with an interesting question. Mohammed, can you ask your question? Please tell us where you come from and ask your question.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
I can.
Hello.
Yes,
hello?
We can hear now. Yeah, we can hear now.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. Did you hear me?
Yes,
very well.
Okay. I am Mohammed from Libya. I am doing PhD. And I am very interested about this summit. And also I'm doing my research like the kidney function by phenylhydrazine and using bimogrenate. Bimogrenate is the fluid to protect from this kidney. As you know, as you see for kidney function or kidney failure, and any hematology now, some doctors, they use the fruits and vegetables to recovering this situation, and also the medicine, okay? That's is very good now in this future. So again, some doctors now, they give the reporters, they give the medicine and also fruits, like for example, pomegranates have full phenolic and full of the minerals and vitamins to protect the body. For example, the vessels as we have today, and also the body function. And thank you very much.
I'm not sure if there was a question in there. Anne or Filippo, did you hear a question?
No.
Okay.
Well, yeah, no specific question, but a lot of interest in
Absolutely.
Not pharmacological stimuli to improve our health. Of course, all these suggestions need to be verified in trials. Now, let's come back to Anne. Anne, I'm sure you have many more interesting questions for Noel.
Yeah.
Please carry on.
Let's come back to your scientific activity, which is really amazing, I think. You have been the founder of Covadis. You mentioned that also before, and it stands for Coronary Vasomotor Disorders International Study Group. And this is an important global task force for the study of functional coronary alterations. Can you tell us more about its activity and its goals?
Great question. My good colleague and scientific partner, Dr. John Beltrame of Adelaide, Australia, and I, because of commonality of invasive coronary function testing and interest in what eventually would be called INOCA, we used to get together at national, the ESC, the American Heart Association, ACC. And one time we were commiserating that there were increasing numbers of interest in publications, but there was no unified nomenclature. There was no unified testing protocols. There was no group that was, evaluating this and trying to develop consensus in these issues of terminology, et cetera. And so, we threw some money together to have an initial meeting and invited folks that we saw were publishing in the area, Professor Korea being one of them. And we liked the idea that it would be international. We weren't in a position to formulate guidelines. We were independent, right? Just a group of investigators getting together. But on the other hand, then you can do whatever you want to do. You're not beholden to a society's set of rules and policies. So with that inaugural meeting, which was incredibly gratifying, very scientifically excellent in terms of exchange. Over a couple of years, we, decided as a steering committee that we would meet immediately after the ESC, which is our most international annual scientific sessions. And we have for, I don't know, Filippo, 12, 15 years at this point? Sure. We have probably 30 plus publications, meaning on behalf of Covadis. And what we probably should do now that I am remembering that history, we should probably publish whether or not we've achieved any of those unified goals, right? We were hoping to unify terminology and to some extent protocol testing, invasive with the functional testing, as well as non-invasive with PET and MRI. That might be a good agenda item for our upcoming meeting.
Absolutely, Noel, we'll work on that.
Okay,
and you have other questions from your side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have also been involved in INOCA, you mentioned that too, and that stands for ischemia and no obstructive coronary artery disease. And that's a patient-driven initiative, as I understand it. How important is it? And do you think that patients should be more involved in scientific societies and in guideline preparations?
Yes, INOCA International is a patient advocate group. They also have an annual meeting more recently, probably maybe the last 4 to 5 years. And I think we'll see how this all turns out. There are examples of other patient advocacy groups that actually fundraise and support preliminary studies as well as more definitive studies. For example, we just became a member of the International ISCAD. It's an international registry of spontaneous coronary artery dissection. And that is actually something that is almost rare, right? And so you really need a large network of people contributing data to start to make any sense about root etiologies, potential treatment targets. And so, will INOCA International start to do that for us? That I think that would be a desired outcome. They also, create awareness, and I think certainly community awareness. There probably are lots of patients out there. My colleague, Dr. Martha Golati, is a health outcomes researcher and has done a number of different surveys. And there are women and men out there that are disabled, not able to go to work because of their angina, which is not either being addressed with their local treating physicians or dismissed. So we'll see. I mean, I'm hopeful that, good things will come of this.
And can you share what's in your scientific pipeline right now?
We do a lot of advanced imaging. Again, Dr. Dan Berman's infrastructure here, along with now a PhD physicist, Dr. D.B. Ali, with his multiple 3 Tesla MRIs, but as well as PET, as well as CCTA. If there's an advanced imaging technique, we are interested in it. As you know, as you read my bio, I trained in nuclear medicine as my subspecialty. So why did I do that? I did rat experiments as an undergraduate, and they were stinky, smelly, often were trying to bite me. And
Yes, they do that.
and when I got into medical school, I really liked my patients. I didn't like the rats, but I really liked my patients. And last but not least, during my cardiology training, people were encouraging me to go back to, answer these questions in rodent models. And I was like, why would I do that if I can see it? Here's a scan. Here's a scan that actually, and the MRI is tissue characterization. And Dr. D.B. Ali comes up with new stuff every year. We now have, you don't even have to correct for heart motion in many of his scans. So we're just really excited. So you asked, what are we most excited about? Probably the thing that I'm pretty excited about right now is one of our knowledge gaps was we did follow these original wise women, almost 1,000, for 10 years. And at the 5 to 7 years where we were able to adjudicate outcomes, the most frequent adverse outcome was not heart attack. It was not stroke. It was not sudden cardiac death, although those did occur about 2.5% per year. The most frequent was heart failure. And when we did an in-depth chart review and we published this, it was HFpEF, heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, which also preferentially impacts women, right? 60-40. So we've done a fair amount of work of trying to understand mechanistically what that is all about. Is it due to increasing late gadolinium scar with micro infarcts that are missed because the troponin thresholds don't pick up small heart attacks in women? We have some data to suggest that. Is it adverse remodeling and increasing fibrosis? We have some data that suggests that. Nothing super definitive, which is why we're working on this. But one of the hypotheses, also my junior colleague, Dr. Janet Way, who trained with us and is now faculty, one of the other hypotheses, because of the MRI, and we can do magnetic resonance spectroscopy. So not only can we do tissue characterization, we can do metabolism. And what we discovered when we did a pilot study that she published in the American Journal of Physiology is that our coronary microvascular dysfunction patients that had elevated LV-EDPs, they had myocardial steatosis, meaning the heart muscle was filled up with triglycerides. Mm-hmm. And so that's now the genesis of her primary project called an R01. That's our NIH, kind of 5-year relatively big funding. And we're doing that spectroscopy and we're mapping out mechanistic pathways with the hypothesis. And there are rare disease models, but as we study HFpEF, there are other investigators that are doing some of these metabolomics, either because of biopsies or animal studies that demonstrate that these failing hearts that have preserved ejection fraction are failing to use free fatty acids as energy. And they're failing, the next backup is glucose. And they're failing to use glucose. And so they're using these ketones, these alternative sources of energy that likely are not great and probably result in this fat overload of the heart muscle. And then the heart gets stiff and doesn't work. So anyway, that's probably, our most exciting right now, but we have a lot going on.
But that sounds
good.
really exciting. I think that's sounds great.
Yeah, and you can do
Well-
it without cutting anybody up and without doing biopsies.
Yeah.
Well, really, really fascinating perspectives for the future. I can read another interesting question from Roberto Carbone. It's practical question. I think it would be nice to share with us and with Noel. Roberto, can you ask your question? Can we unmute Roberto Carbone?
Yes, my question is, in ischemic coronary disease, one patient suffering from asthma, bronchial asthma, and this patient take the beta-2 agonist. Is it correct to use, because there is another disease, the ischemic coronary disease, to use, for example, the beta blockers therapy treatment? Is it correct or no?
Good question.
The same patients, asthmatic
Yeah,
patients.
exactly. And so, we encounter this clinically pretty regularly, either lifelong asthma, adult onset, some, early emphysema or even COPD, and they use an inhaler and they have microvascular dysfunction. We will, we first determine the level of, obstructed lung disease. Sorry, I'm messing up. And, if they've been hospitalized, if they've been on and off of steroids, if they're on 3 different bronchodilators, we typically would not prescribe a beta blocker. But if they use an inhaler occasionally, they answer no to all of those other questions. And again, we preferentially go with the alpha beta blockers. That's not to say that we don't have, many of our patients, we are second and third opinions, and the community cardiologist often has started them on an extended release of metoprolol, for example. I don't like atenolol, but, metoprolol once or twice a day, I think is a reasonable, and if they say they got better on it, I'm like, okay, this is empiric testing. But that would be how we would manage somebody with bronchospastic lung disease.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Noel. Thank you. I fully agree with you, with your clinical wisdom. Well, you had let's change page again. You are the director of the Barbara Streisand Center. We all love Barbara Streisand. Can you tell us about this interesting story?
The world loves Barbara, and she's just an amazing person. She's, the only woman and one of the few people that have won Oscars for acting, producing, and directing. That's the trifecta. And she did it at a time too when, there's a lot of noise now about women in film, women in entertainment, and, DEI initiatives that I think are helping women. But Barbara did it when, people would look at her and say, you can't do that. And she did it. So she's an amazing person. She's also an amazing person because of her advocacy. There is no disparity that she has met that she didn't want to address. Any kind of discrimination, any kind of unfair, unequal treatment. So I, back in the day, my institution had charged me with starting and sustaining a general women's health program. This was in part to compete for other NIH funds as well as other institutions. And my heart wasn't in it. I'm a cardiologist. I mean, come on, I don't want to do osteoporosis. At that time, women's health was defined by bikini medicine, right? Reproductive organs, breasts, ovaries, uterus. That's not me. And I was, after some seed money, struggling for funding. And yet I was being held accountable, of course. And so my department chair at the time, Department of Medicine chair, Glenn Bronstein, now retired, he said, Noelle, I think you'd be really good at fundraising. And I was young, and I was raised, you don't talk about money. My family was, no, you don't talk about money. And so I was like, I don't know. I don't think I'd be good at fundraising. But he had me work with the development people, and I would encourage anyone to do this, because it's not that hard, and there are people that want to help your cause, and you make them feel good by allowing them to help what you're doing. These INOCA International patients, you have to imagine that they feel good about their participation in helping us do this important work. Anyway, I read in the Los Angeles Times right around that time that my chair said I should do fundraising, that Barbara Streisand was going on tour. And as per her routine, the proceeds would go to a charitable cause. And that this tour was going to go to a women's health cause. And I was like, that should be me, not me, but this cause. And I cared for a patient at the time that was one of her colleagues who socialized with her. He was a producer, and he saw her pretty regularly. He would always tell me this. And so I put a brochure together, and I asked if he could give it to her the next time he saw her socially. And he did. And the rest is history. She called, here's the end of the story. I'm at an ABIM, the American Board of Internal Medicine cardiovascular disease subspecialty test question writing committee. So I'm in Philadelphia. It's 3 hours ahead of my usual time. So it's 10 o'clock at night, which is now 1 a.m. So I'm tired and I want to go to bed. And the hotel phone rings, not my mobile. The hotel phone rings and says, please hold for Barbara Streisand. And again, I was with my buddy, Kim Allen Williams, who put me on this committee. And I said, Kim, this is not funny. I'm tired.
It's a joke.
And I just about hung up. And this poor female voice said, so you don't want to talk to Barbara Streisand? And I said, oh, okay. And so we talked for an hour, and she was very interested. She had received the materials, had a lot of questions. Why were women dying of heart disease? Why did this happen? What was the disparity? What could we do about it? The rest is history.
Well, Noelle, I was right when I said before, you have many talents. You are a top scientist, been very active in sex-related issues, extremely successful in fundraising. I have a final question, a personal question. You are a fascinating lady. Did you ever had the temptation to become an actress, or cardiology has been the love of your life?
No, I didn't. I had no temptations. I played violin and switched to viola when they needed violas in grade school and high school. So I was always in the pit orchestra. And I think I'm probably too much of a private person. I think actors have to really put themselves out there. That would be my perception. I had no interest in going up and pretending to be somebody else. No, that's an unusual question, Filippo.
Okay, but you are an unusual person.
That's
remarkable,
true.
Remarkable, unusual person.
Yeah.
Noelle, thank you for sharing with us also these considerations. One final question I always ask: any suggestion for our webinar, for our dialogues? Did you like it, or what can we improve?
Yes, I think this is fabulous. We were chatting before we started. There used to be in many of the journals, personal interviews with, faculty leader investigators, and I loved reading them. Rob Califf, Filippo Crea, because it really gives you a sense of who they are and how they think. And the journals, when they started counting pages, stopped that. So I see this as a valuable asset. And my one suggestion is to make it into a podcast and distribute it more widely. I'm aware that it is on Twitter and YouTube, but on YouTube, you'd have to look for it. You'd have to say, I want to see a specific thing. So we have a shortage of women going into cardiology in the US. I think this is probably true in Europe as well. In the US, it's resulting in a workforce shortage. So distributing this to internal medicine and medical schools even, I think would make a lot of sense.
Thank you, Noel. Definitely, we will follow your suggestion regarding the podcast. And it's been a very interesting hour. Not surprisingly, I wish to thank you and thank Anne for this pleasant conversation, and remind our colleagues that the next dialogue will be on the last Thursday of July, will be on the 28th of July at 5 o'clock Central European Time. And next dialogue we go from Los Angeles to Boston, will be with Paul Ridker. I will host him with Lina Badimon, and of course you are very welcome. Thank you again, Noel and Anne, and all of you for this interesting conversation. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for joining, and have a good rest of your day. We'll just wait for everybody to sign off.
Thank you, Amelia and Suzanne.
Thank you, Noel.
Perfect setup.
Thank you, Noel. Thank
I'm
you
off
very
to
much.
clinic. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Have a good clinic.
Thank you very much.
you.
We'll stay in touch. Bye-bye.
Very enjoyable. Bye-bye.
Thank you.